Hello, we're doing checkpoint 1.18 from section 1.3. Here we're asked to evaluate a sine and a cosine function evaluated at some special value. Well, 3 pi over 4 and pi over 6, we have to figure out what those, or negative pi over 6, we have to figure out what those values are and what they correspond to in the reference angles. So before we do this, I want to show you a couple of tricks to try to remember some important values for the sine and the cosine. And the first trick I want to show you is to make up a table of these values. And we're going to use just the reference angles in the first quadrant. Starting with 0, pi over 6, pi over 4, pi over 3, and pi over 2. So these are the theta angles, and the first one, let's label that as sine theta, and the second one is cosine theta. And you know, you can tack on a tangent if you need to. If you remember, the tangent is just the sine over cosine. And what I want you to think about is, for each of these slots, we're starting with a sine. For each of these slots, we're going to think about that as the square root of something. So think about including the square root of something divided by 2. And I'll put a star here, where star is going to be equal to 0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we're going to fill that up. We're going to use, or we're going to fill in the sine row with this information. And it's just a matter of simplifying as well. So for example, we have sine of 0 is going to be the square root of 0 divided by 2. But what is the square root of 0? The square root of 0 is just 0. So square root of 0 over 2 is 0, and that's the first one. Next is the square root of 1 over 2. Square root of 1 is just 1, so this is just the 1/2. So that's our second value. Root 2 over 2 cannot be simplified. Square root of 3 over 2 cannot be simplified. But the square root of 4 over 2 is 2 over 2, which is equal to 1. So that's the last slot here, 1. Okay, so now just by remembering square root of something over 2 and just remember to count from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, you can fill out the whole row for the sine functions in the first quadrant. And these are usually what we want to use as reference angles. For the cosine, we just do it backwards. We'll start with 1, and then root 3 over 2, root 2 over 2, 1/2, and then 0. Okay, so I hope that's easy enough to remember. And once we know that, that's the first part of kind of memorizing a bunch of these things that we want to try to remember and, you know, get to know over time. All right. Next is, since we are using the reference angles, we want to be able to look at the different values from the different quadrants. And we know that these reference angles are all in the first quadrant. And all in the first quadrant, they're all just going to be positive. And I don't know if you remember the mnemonic for this, but if you go from the first, second, third, fourth quadrant in that order, and remember that all students take calculus, that kind of is our mnemonic that helps us remember that this is we can think about this as not just the axes, x and y axis, but a plus sign. And then with this plus sign, all the trig functions are positive. Here, only the sine is positive, the cosine is negative, but that also means that the tangent is negative. Here, the tangent is positive, but that also says that the sine divided by the cosine have to have the same sign. It turns out that both the sine and the cosine are negative here. That's what makes the tangent positive. And here the cosine is positive and sine and tangent are negative. Okay, so that's the other piece that we want to try to remember. Now we'll try to do these problems using the idea of reference angles. So first we'll have the cosine of 3 pi over 2, or 3 pi over 4. And pi over 4 is this measurement over here. And if you count with that same equal measurement parts, pi over 4, this would be 2 pi over 4, which is pi over 2. And this is 3 pi over 4. And we see that 3 pi over 4 is in the third quadrant. Okay? Now, because 3 pi over 4 is in the third quadrant, we know that the sine is positive. We also know then that the cosine is negative. So cosine is negative. And so if we use the reference angle, and the reference angle for us is that it's this angle that this thing makes with the positive x-axis. And if this is 3 pi over 4, that makes our reference angle pi over 4. And we also said that the sine was positive, which means the cosine and tangent are negative, so that means this is a negative value. Then we're looking at the negative cosine of pi over 4. So we have negative cosine of pi over 4 is root 2 over 2 with a negative sign in front, and this is our value right here. Okay, so that's the first one. Now let's do the second one. Here we have the sine of negative pi over 6. Sine, let's get our pen working, of negative pi over 6. So the sine of negative pi over 6. So negative pi over 6 is a negative measurement going in the opposite direction. So that puts us in the fourth quadrant. And negative pi over 6 is this, pi over 6 is this measurement. So that means the reference angle is also pi over 6. So this is going to be pi over 6, a reference angle. Now in the fourth quadrant, the cosine is positive, which means the sine and the tangent are negative. So that means this must also be negative. Okay, now that we know that, we have to find the sine of pi over 6. Pi over 6 is 1/2, or sine of pi over 6 is 1/2. And then we have that negative in front, so our result should be negative 1/2. Okay, so that's it. Try to remember the mnemonic, commit it to memory, write it down a bunch of times, explain it to other people, and try to remember this, and remember that the tangent is sine over cosine, so you just do the whatever you need to do to figure out the sine over cosine, and that'll give us that will allow us to be able to find values of anything that is going to be within these set of nice angles in anywhere on the plane in any quadrant, because we can just use the reference angles. Okay, I hope that helps. Good luck.